What happens when the greatest empire the world has ever known simply fades away? Tonight, you'll drift through the story of Rome, from its rise as a tiny settlement on the Tiber River, to an empire of glittering marble and endless roads, to its slow unraveling into ruin. It is a tale of ambition and triumph, but also of mistakes, betrayals, and the quiet truth that even the mightiest fall. As you listen, let the centuries pass softly, and let Rome's story carry you into sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but if you really like what I'm doing here, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always happy to see who is joining us from around the world. So dim your light, let the world quiet down, and get comfortable. We begin in silence. Huts by the Tiber, c. 1000, 753 BCS. The story of Rome begins long before marble columns gleamed beneath the Italian sun. In the centuries around 1000 BCE, the banks of the Tiber River were quiet, dotted with small clusters of huts that clung to the slopes of the hills. These huts, circular and modest, were built from mud, wood, and straw. Their roofs, made of thatch, sloped low against the wind and rain, while smoke curled steadily from central hearths. Archaeologists have uncovered their traces on the Palatine Hill hollows in the earth where posts once stood, fragments of pottery, the dark stains left by ancient fires. These are the earliest physical whispers of the city that would one day command the known world. The Tiber, broad and steady, shaped the rhythm of these people's lives. It gave them fish to catch and a natural crossing point between Etruria in the north and Campania in the south. Traders passed along its waters, leaving behind fragments of goods, bronze, fine ceramics, and salt. This land was fertile and defensible, positioned where the seven hills rose gently above the plain, safe from floods, but close enough to the river to drink from its flow. Each hill became home to its own small community, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine. They were not yet united, but together they formed a patchwork of villages destined to grow into one city. These early Latins farmed grain and tended herds, their days set by the sun and the seasons. Men guided oxen across furrows of rich soil, the bronze tips of their ploughs glinting in morning light. Women ground flour with stone querns, kneading bread that baked on hot coals, its scent rising warmly through the huts. Children carried water from the river and gathered firewood in the surrounding groves. Life was simple, but it carried the hum of endurance. They were not alone in this land. The Sabines, Etruscans, and other Italic peoples dwelt nearby. Each group brought its own customs, its own gods, and its own struggles. Religious life bound the communities together. The Latins believed the world around them teemed with divine presence. Spirits dwelt in household hearths, in sacred groves, and in the flowing waters of the Tiber. Each family honored the Lares and Penates, the guardians of home and food. Offerings of grain or wine were made to ensure protection and prosperity. In the twilight, beneath skies salted with stars, simple rituals unfolded at altars of stone and wood. There were no temples yet, only gestures of reverence, but these practices planted seeds for Rome's deep devotion to ritual and ceremony, a devotion that would later define its public and political life. Legends tell of this time, blending memory with myth. The people told stories of a Trojan hero named Aeneas, who fled the burning city of Troy around the 12th century BCE, carrying his father on his back and the household gods in his arms. After long wandering, he arrived in Italy, where his descendants would one day found Rome. Whether or not these tales held truth mattered little. They provided identity, linking these humble villagers to a grand epic of survival and destiny. And still another legend, whispered in generations to come, told of twins abandoned by the river, saved by a she-wolf, and raised to become founders of a city eternal. Daily life, however, unfolded in the rhythm of necessity. Villagers wore simple garments woven from wool, dyed with earthy tones of brown and red. Jewelry was sparse, crafted from bone or bronze. Tools, too, reflected practicality: axes for clearing trees, sickles for harvesting grain, clay vessels for storing food and water. The settlement, though modest, was not isolated from progress. Trade routes carried influences from the Etruscans, whose artistry in metal and engineering was far ahead, and from the Greeks, whose colonies dotted the southern coasts of Italy. Over time, these influences shaped the Latins, sharpening their skills, broadening their culture, and preparing them unknowingly for greatness. Conflict was never far away. Small disputes over land, cattle, or water sometimes flared between neighbours, leading to skirmishes fought with spears and crude shields. Yet even in these struggles lay the first steps toward order. Elders mediated, offering judgment that others respected. Slowly, rules emerged, unwritten yet understood, shaping a kind of fragile governance. The idea that disputes could be resolved not only by strength but by shared agreement planted early roots for what would later become Roman law, famed across centuries. The hills, the huts, the people, none could yet imagine the empire that would rise from their soil. They lived close to the earth, their world no larger than the horizon of the Italian hills. But already, their location gave them a quiet advantage. They stood at a crossroads, a place where trade routes intersected, where cultures mingled, where rivers carried goods and ideas alike. Their survival, their rituals, their legends, all of these strands would weave into the fabric of Rome. By 753 BCE, tradition tells, Romulus would trace a furrow in the earth to mark the walls of a city. But for centuries before, life had already been building toward that moment. The huts by the Tiber, humble and fragile, were the beginning. In their smoke, their soil, their stories, the eternal city was being prepared softly, steadily, like dawn rising across the hills. The kings of early Rome, 753-509 BCE. The huts by the Tiber slowly gave way to a city, and tradition held that it began with a single man, Romulus, who in 753 BCE, after quarrelling with his twin brother Remus, drew the first boundary line and became Rome's first king. The story told that Remus mocked his brother's wall, leaping over it, and Romulus struck him down, declaring that so would it be with anyone who crossed Rome's defences. Whether this tale was legend, memory, or metaphor, it carried weight, for it explained why Romans guarded their city with such fierce devotion. Romulus, remembered as warrior and builder, gathered shepherds, fugitives and wanderers, opening asylum to all, and in doing so gave Rome its first character, a city of many peoples forged into one. The monarchy that followed lasted more than 2 centuries, from 753 BCE until the expulsion of the last king in 509 BCE. In this time, Rome was shaped by 7 rulers, some remembered as wise, others as tyrants, each leaving marks upon the city's early life. Under Numa Pompilius, the second king, peace and religion took root. Numa was said to have established Rome's priesthoods, its sacred rituals, its calendar of festivals. He built the Temple of Janus, whose doors stood open in times of war and closed in peace. Though myth surrounds his reign, the traditions he was credited with endure in Roman religion: reverence for fire, sacrifice, and the sacred bonds between men and gods. Rome's third king, Tullus Hostilius, carried the city back into war. He was remembered for his conquest of Alba Longa, another Latin settlement, where the contest of the Horatii and Curiatii triplets from each city decided the fate of their people. Alba Longa was destroyed, its inhabitants brought to Rome, and once again the city grew not only by birth but by incorporation. The Roman pattern of absorbing others began here, not through destruction alone but through weaving new citizens into the fabric of Rome itself. Then came Ancus Marcius, who ruled with balance, blending war and peace. He was credited with building Rome's first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, a feat that connected the city more firmly to the lands around it. He also established Ostia, the port at the river's mouth, ensuring Rome access to the sea. Under Ancus, Rome began to stretch outward, claiming territory beyond its immediate hills, its gaze fixed on horizons once distant. The fifth king, Tarquinius Priscus, was of Etruscan origin, a reminder of how neighbouring cultures shaped Rome. He was said to have doubled the Senate and begun major works, such as the Circus Maximus, where future generations would gather for races and games. He also began construction of the great sewers, the Cloaca Maxima, that drained marshy lands between the hills, laying foundations for the Roman Forum. In his reign, the blending of Etruscan skill with Latin ambition gave Rome the beginnings of its monumental character. Servius Tullius, the sixth king, was remembered as a reformer. He was said to have introduced Rome's first census, dividing citizens into classes based on wealth, and from these divisions emerged the structure of Rome's army and its political assemblies. His reign reflected order, structure, and inclusion, for it recognized not just patricians, the noble families, but the broader population, the plebeians, whose role in the city was beginning to grow. He expanded Rome's boundaries, extending its sacred walls, the Pomerium, and binding new hills into the city's life. The monarchy ended with Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, whose name carried shadows of tyranny. His reign, remembered for arrogance and cruelty, brought great works, temples, fortifications, but also growing resentment. The tale of Lucretia, dishonoured by the king's son and driven to despair, sparked outrage that led noble families to drive the Tarquins from power. In 509 BCE, the monarchy ended, and Rome vowed never again to suffer kings. The cry for liberty echoed, and from it was born the Republic, a new system in which power would be shared, checked, and contested. In these centuries of kings, Rome grew from scattered huts into a true city. Stone replaced wood, temples rose above altars, markets filled with voices, and walls encircled the settlement with strength. The people worshipped their gods with greater order, fought their wars with greater discipline, and governed themselves with sharper rules. Though much of what is told of the kings lies within legend, archaeology confirms the growth. Fortifications, drainage works, imported goods, and evidence of population blending. These early centuries, 753–509 BCE, gave Rome its identity, a people both fierce and adaptable, reverent and ambitious, bound together by ritual, law, and the will to endure. And as night fell over the early city, the lamps of oil and fire flickered across stone and thatch, casting shadows of men who believed they were building not just homes, but destiny. The monarchy faded, but its memory lingered in Roman minds, as both guide and warning for all that was to come. The birth of the Republic, 509–390 BCE. When Tarquin the Proud was cast from Rome in 509 BCE, the city stood at a threshold between past and future. The people had known kingship for more than 2 centuries, but now, with outrage smouldering against tyranny, they swore never again to submit to the rule of one man. In place of monarchy arose the Republic, a new order in which power would be divided among magistrates, balanced by councils and watched over by the Senate. At the heart of this transformation stood the office of consul, 2 men elected each year, each holding equal authority, each able to check the other. This system, fragile at first, embodied a principle that would define Rome for centuries. No man should wield unchecked power, and liberty was to be protected by law, not whim. Yet liberty, as the Romans understood it, was not a democracy for all, but a shield for the elite families who now dominated politics. The patricians, wealthy and noble, filled the Senate's ranks and guided decisions, while the plebeians, the common citizens, carried the burdens of war and labour without sharing equal voice. The tension between these orders began almost at once, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and compromise that would shape the Republic's resilience. In these early decades, Rome's survival was far from secure. Neighbouring peoples, the Latins, the Sabines, the Volci, the Aequi, the Etruscans, watched the fledgling republic with wary eyes. Some saw opportunity in Rome's internal struggles. Others sought to reclaim lands lost in earlier wars. Battles were fought on the city's very doorstep, with alarms sounding at dawn and farmers abandoning fields to take up shields. The Romans learned quickly that their survival depended upon discipline and solidarity. For each year, consuls led citizen soldiers into campaigns meant not only to defend but to expand. The army was drawn not from professionals but from the people themselves, called forth by the census to serve according to their means. Wealthier citizens, equipping themselves with armor and horses, poorer men carrying spears and slings. The burden of war weighed heavily, yet it forged unity. For to fight for Rome was to defend not merely land, but the sacred promise of liberty that had replaced kingship. Within the city, life unfolded in rhythms both fragile and determined. The Forum, once a marsh drained by the Cloaca Maxima, became the heart of public life. Citizens gathered to hear laws read aloud, to trade goods brought from farms and villages, to share news of victories and defeats. Temples rose above the Forum, their columns gleaming in the sun, reminders that Rome's gods watched over every treaty, oath, and battle. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, begun under the kings and completed under the Republic, stood as a symbol of Rome's enduring devotion to the divine, binding the city's destiny to the will of heaven. Priests tended fires, augurs read omens in the flight of birds, and sacrifices marked the turning of seasons, weaving sacred time into the city's daily existence. In these practices, the Romans believed their strength lay not only in arms but in piety, the careful attention to the gods that ensured fortune's favour. Yet beneath the surface of religious devotion and military vigour simmered the struggle of the orders, the long contest between patricians and plebeians. The plebeians, weary of bearing the weight of war without equal rights, pressed for change. They threatened to withdraw from the city, to leave its walls undefended, unless their voices were heard. In response, Rome created the office of tribune of the plebs, officials chosen from among the common people, invested with the power to protect their fellows from injustice. By standing at the threshold of law, by uttering a single word veto, a tribune could halt actions that threatened the plebeians. This was a remarkable innovation, one that balanced patrician authority with plebeian resistance, embedding within the Republic a system of negotiation and compromise that, though fraught with tension, gave Rome its resilience. Over time, further concessions came. Written laws in the 12 tables, posted for all to see around 450 BCE, ending the patricians' monopoly on legal knowledge and granting citizens a common code. These laws were harsh in places, permitting debt bondage, harsh punishments, and strict hierarchies. But they marked a turning point in Rome's march towards structured governance, a recognition that justice required transparency. The Republic's trials came not only from within, but from without. In 509 BCE, the expelled king Tarquin sought aid from Etruscan allies, leading to battles where Rome's liberty hung by a thread. Heroes emerged in these struggles, their names carried forward as symbols of Roman virtue. Horatius Cocles, who held a bridge against an advancing force until it collapsed behind him. Mucius Scaevola, who thrust his hand into fire to prove his courage before an enemy king. Cloelia, a maiden who swam the Tiber to lead fellow captives to freedom. Whether fact or legend, these tales gave Romans models of bravery and sacrifice, proof that individuals could embody the spirit of the Republic. Such stories were retold by parents to children, by magistrates to citizens, shaping a culture where endurance, discipline, and loyalty were exalted above wealth or comfort. Then came the shock that nearly ended Rome before its greatness had begun. In 390 BCE, a horde of Gauls swept down from the north, fierce warriors from beyond the Alps, their hair wild, their weapons strange, their battle cries terrifying. At the river Allia, Rome's forces faltered, and the Gauls marched upon the city itself. Panic spread as gates fell and flames licked at rooftops. The Forum, once the heart of civic pride, lay in ashes, its temples desecrated, its streets silent beneath the conqueror's tread. Only the Capitoline Hill held firm, where a small garrison resisted through siege. Tradition tells of sacred geese, whose cries warned the defenders of a night assault, saving the stronghold from capture. In the end, Rome paid ransom in gold to buy the Gauls' withdrawal, a humiliation seared into memory. The image of Brennus, the Gallic leader, tossing his sword onto the scales and declaring "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished, burned in Roman pride like a scar. Yet from this disaster came resolve. The city, though shattered, rose again. Houses were rebuilt, walls strengthened, armies reformed. The sack of Rome did not break the Republic, it steeled it. Romans vowed that never again would they allow such humiliation, and this vow propelled them to new heights of discipline, expansion, and unity. The Republic, still young, had endured tyranny, internal strife, and foreign invasion, and yet it remained. The years from 509 to 390 BCE forged Rome's character, suspicious of kings, devoted to liberty, disciplined in war, and bound by laws that all could see. The scars of invasion lingered, but so too did the lessons of survival, lessons that would shape every step of Rome's long march toward empire. Rome rebuilds after invasion, 390–264 BCE. The sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BCE left the city smouldering and shaken, yet not destroyed. For months, blackened stones and collapsed walls bore silent witness to the terror that had swept through the streets. The humiliation of paying ransom in gold seared itself into memory, and Romans repeated the tale with grim determination. Never again would their city bow so low. In the wake of ruin, they turned their grief into resolve, rebuilding with fresh stone, raising walls taller and stronger, fortifying gates with iron. Out of the ashes, a new Rome emerged, scarred yet more resilient, a city with a vow etched into its soul that defeat would never again define it. The years that followed were a crucible of constant warfare. Rome, still small compared to the great powers around it, faced relentless threats from neighbours. The Volsci, Aequi, Etruscans, and Samnites tested its strength again and again. Each year, consuls marched out at the head of citizen armies, calling farmers from their fields to take up shields and spears. The Roman legions, once loosely formed lines of hoplites like the Greeks, began to evolve into more flexible units. The manipular system, small, disciplined blocks of soldiers, allowed Rome to adapt to rugged terrain and shifting enemies, granting it an edge that would grow sharper with each generation. Service was grueling. Campaigns often stretched long into the harvest season, and families at home bore the cost. Yet each victory brought new lands, new allies, and fresh confidence that the city was destined not merely to survive, but to dominate. The wars with the Etruscans to the north proved both bloody and decisive. Once Rome's cultural teachers, the Etruscans became rivals whose cities contested dominance of central Italy. Veii, powerful and proud, fell after a long siege in 396 BCE, its lands absorbed and its people brought into Rome's fold. This conquest doubled Rome's territory and marked a turning point. Rome no longer fought simply for defense, but for expansion. Yet expansion required more than victory, it required integration. Rome showed unusual skill in weaving conquered peoples into its system. Some were granted full citizenship, others partial rights, all bound by treaties that ensured loyalty. Where other cities conquered only to oppress, Rome expanded by offering a stake in its future. In this way, step by step, it built not merely an army but a confederation of allies who would march under Rome's standards for centuries to come. The Samnite Wars, stretching from 343 to 290 BCE, tested Rome's endurance like few others. The Samnites, fierce mountain people from southern Italy, fought with cunning and ferocity, their warriors skilled in ambush and terrain. Battles were brutal, sometimes disastrous, as when Roman armies were trapped and humiliated at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, forced to pass under the enemy yoke as a symbol of submission. Yet Rome did not collapse. Defeat bred only greater determination, and within decades the Samnites themselves were subdued, their strength broken, their lands incorporated into Rome's growing sphere. These wars hardened the Roman legions, teaching them adaptability and perseverance, qualities that would later carry them far beyond the Apennines. During these same centuries, Rome's political fabric stretched and changed. The conflict of the orders, the struggle between patricians and plebeians, pressed onward. Plebeians, long excluded from the highest offices, demanded greater rights, and their persistence slowly yielded reforms. By 367 BCE, the Licinian Sextian laws opened the consulship itself to plebeians, a monumental step toward equality. In time, plebeians would also gain access to the Senate and to priesthoods once reserved for patricians. The Republic, though unequal, showed a rare ability to adapt, balancing aristocratic power with popular demand. Each compromise, though hard-won, made the system more resilient. Where other cities fractured under class strife, Rome endured, and endurance was its greatest strength. The Forum bustled with this evolving life. Markets filled with grain, olives, wine, and livestock brought in from conquered lands. Merchants from Latium, Campania, and beyond haggled beneath the gaze of temples and magistrates. Laws were posted for all to see, etched into bronze tablets. Citizens gathered to vote in assemblies, their voices carrying weight in the slow machinery of the Republic. Religion remained the heartbeat of the city festivals honored Jupiter, Mars, and Vesta. Sacrifices marked victories and treaties. Augurs lifted their eyes to the skies, reading divine will in the flight of birds. The people believed that Rome's fortune was tied to its piety, that victories were won not only by steel but by faith. In 390 BCE, Rome had been burned. By 264 BCE, it stood as the master of Italy. Through conquest and alliance, it controlled the peninsula from the Po Valley in the north to the heel and toe of the south. Roads stitched the land together, milestones marking Roman order across rugged terrain. Colonies spread Roman language, laws, and customs into once foreign places. Where once Rome had feared its neighbours, now its neighbours bent to Rome. Yet even as Italy lay secured, Rome's gaze turned outward, across the seas where another power, Carthage, ruled. The centuries of rebuilding after the Gallic sack had forged a republic stronger than ever, prepared now to contest not just Italy but the Mediterranean itself. And as twilight fell across the Forum, where torches flickered and traders closed their stalls, Romans could look upon their city and see not the scars of fire but the outlines of greatness. In the steady march from 390 to 264 BCE, Rome had transformed from survivor to conqueror, its destiny stretching far beyond the hills where it was born. Clash with Carthage, 264–146 BCE. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had secured Italy under her command, the long years of struggle against Latins, Etruscans and Samnites, ending with treaties that bound allies to her cause. The city, once burned by the Gauls, now stood confident behind its walls, its legions hardened by decades of war. Yet beyond the peninsula, across the waters of the Mediterranean, another power flourished: Carthage, a mighty city on the North African coast, founded centuries earlier by Phoenician traders. Carthage commanded the seas, its harbours crowded with ships, its markets spilling with goods from Spain, Sicily, and beyond. Where Rome's power rested on legions and alliances, Carthage's strength lay in trade, wealth, and naval mastery. It was inevitable that these two forces, each growing and restless, would clash. The contest, beginning in 264 BCE and ending in 146 BCE, would be known as the Punic Wars. 3 long struggles that would decide who ruled the Mediterranean. The First Punic War, 264–241 BCE, began with a dispute over Sicily, a fertile island coveted by both powers. Rome, unskilled at sea, built fleets from scratch, their timbers cut from Italian forests, their designs borrowed from captured Carthaginian vessels. Innovation marked their effort. The corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike, allowed Roman soldiers to turn naval battles into infantry fights, where their discipline excelled. Battles raged across the waters for more than 2 decades. Victories and defeats balanced like scales. At Mylae, the Corvus secured Rome's first great naval triumph. At other times, storms swallowed fleets whole, drowning thousands. By 241 BCE, however, Carthage sued for peace, ceding Sicily, the first province outside Italy to fall under Roman rule. For Rome, this was a turning point, the step from a land power into a Mediterranean force. Peace did not last. In 218 BCE, Carthage's great general Hannibal Barca marched from Spain across the Pyrenees through Gaul and over the snowbound Alps, leading an army that included war elephants. His feat remains legendary. Columns of men and beasts trudging through ice and rock, ambushed by tribes, battered by weather, yet descending into Italy itself. For years, Hannibal ravaged the peninsula. His victories at Trebia, Trasimene, and especially Cannae in 216 BCE shocking Rome to its core. At Cannae, tens of thousands of Romans fell, surrounded and crushed in a single day, a disaster seared into Roman memory. The Republic wavered, allies defected, and panic spread. Yet Rome did not surrender. Consuls refused negotiations, and the Senate decreed that the war must be fought until victory. Rome raised new legions, even enlisting slaves and boys, and endured. It was this refusal to yield that defined Rome's spirit. The tide turned with Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus, who carried the war into Spain and then across the sea into Africa. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio faced Hannibal himself. Roman discipline and Numidian cavalry carried the day, breaking Carthage's strength. The Second Punic War ended, leaving Rome master not only of Italy but of Spain and much of the western Mediterranean. Hannibal, though undefeated in spirit, fled into exile, his brilliance unable to overcome Rome's relentless endurance. The Third Punic War, 149–146 BCE, came after decades of tension, fueled by Roman suspicion that Carthage might rise again. Voices in the Senate, like that of Cato the Elder, ended every speech with the words, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. At last, Rome acted. Legions besieged the city, cutting it off from trade and supply. For 3 years, the Carthaginians resisted, fighting with desperation, defending their walls with fire and steel. But in 146 BCE, Roman soldiers stormed the city. Flames consumed its temples, its houses, its markets. Survivors were sold into slavery, and the ground itself, according to later legend, was salted to ensure nothing would grow. Carthage, once queen of the seas, was no more. Rome emerged from the Punic Wars transformed. She had defeated a rival of immense power, extended her reach across the seas, and proven her resilience against some of the greatest challenges in her history. But victory carried consequences. With each new province came wealth gain from Sicily, silver from Spain, treasures from the east, and with wealth came inequality. The patricians grew richer, their estates vast, while small farmers struggled. Slaves captured in war filled Roman households and fields, shifting the balance of society. What had once been a city of citizen soldiers began to change into an empire of provinces and exploitation. The Punic Wars, stretching from 264 to 146 BCE, were more than battles of steel and strategy. They were trials of endurance, of will, of identity. They marked Rome's passage from regional power to Mediterranean dominion. Yet within the triumphs lay the seeds of discord, wealth unevenly spread, ambition unchecked, and a hunger for conquest that would not be easily satisfied. The Republic, victorious abroad, began to tremble within. But for now, as the sun set over the ashes of Carthage, Romans believed themselves invincible, their destiny boundless, their empire eternal. Conquest and Consequences, 146–100 BCE. The year 146 BCE marked a moment of triumph and turning for the Roman Republic. In the span of a single year, Rome reduced two ancient powers to ashes, Carthage in the west and Corinth in the east. Carthage, that old rival on the North African coast, was razed to the ground after 3 years of siege, its defenders killed or enslaved, its walls levelled, its proud harbours silenced. Corinth, jewel of Greece, was stormed and plundered, its treasures seized, its citizens chained, and its legacy of philosophy and art carried off to Rome. That year, it seemed as though the Republic stood unchallenged in the Mediterranean world, master not only of Italy but of the seas and lands that once belonged to mighty kingdoms. Triumphs filled the streets of the city. Generals rode in gilded chariots, laurel wreaths crowning their heads, their faces stern as the crowds shouted praise. Behind them marched soldiers carrying spoils of war statues of gods, paintings, weapons, jewels, silver, and prisoners destined for the slave markets. The people cheered, but beneath the triumphal pageantry, the Republic itself was changing in ways that would test its very survival. Victory brought not only glory, but consequences. The destruction of Carthage removed the last rival capable of challenging Rome's supremacy in the western Mediterranean, and the conquest of Greece opened the door to vast cultural treasures. Roman villas soon glittered with Greek statues, their walls hung with Greek paintings, their libraries filled with Greek scrolls. Senators boasted of philosophers advising them, generals quoted Homer, and noblewomen decorated their homes with marble reliefs imported from Athens. Rome had defeated Greece, but in a sense, Greece conquered Rome with its art and ideas. To the older generation, this influx of luxury and refinement seemed dangerous. They feared that the old Roman virtues, simplicity, austerity, discipline, were dissolving in a tide of silk, perfume, and indulgence. For centuries, Romans had prided themselves on frugality, eating barley, porridge, and bread, wearing plain wool, and fighting with grim resolve. Now banquets groaned with delicacies, wine poured from silver cups, and young men studied rhetoric instead of hardening their bodies in the fields. It was said that victory had made Rome rich, and wealth was beginning to make her soft. Yet, it was not only culture that unsettled the Republic. Conquest had brought lands, and lands brought inequality. In earlier generations, the backbone of Rome had been the small farmer, the independent citizen who tilled his own soil, carried his own arms, and fought in defense of the Republic. These farmers filled the legions, returned home to sow crops, and raised families on modest plots. But with the expansion of Rome's territory, enormous tracts of land fell into the hands of the wealthy elite. The rich bought up farms abandoned by men ruined by long military service, combining them into great estates called latifundia. These estates, stretched across Italy, worked not by citizen farmers but by armies of slaves, men and women captured in Spain, Greece, Africa, and Asia. The soil that had once been ploughed by free citizens was now cultivated by chained labourers, whose sweat enriched aristocrats living in villas decorated with mosaics and frescoes. The dispossessed farmers, stripped of livelihood, crowded into Rome itself, swelling the city's population. They became dependent on grain distributions and the patronage of powerful men, their independence gone. The city of Rome in these years reflected this transformation. The streets grew more crowded, filled with beggars, freedmen, merchants, and slaves. Tenements rose high and unsafe, housing thousands in cramped rooms where smoke, noise, and disease lingered. The Forum, once a space of simple markets and political assembly, now bustled with luxury goods. Spices from the East, silks from Asia, wines from Greece, marble and ivory from abroad. Senators walked in fine sandals, their togas edged with purple, servants following behind them with parasols. But in the shadows of temples and basilicas huddled the poor, men who once owned land but now waited in line for cheap grain or sought day labour as porters. The gap between rich and poor widened, and resentment simmered. Rome had grown mighty abroad, but inside her walls inequality festered. It was in this climate that reformers began to speak, men who saw that Rome's victories carried seeds of decay. Among them, none are remembered more vividly than the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, looked upon the plight of dispossessed citizens and proposed a bold law, the redistribution of public land, the ager publicus, to the poor. His plan would restore small farms, revive the citizen soldier class, and check the growth of great estates. Many welcomed his vision, but the Senate, filled with landowners, resisted bitterly. Conflict erupted. When Tiberius sought re-election, a move seen as a violation of custom, his enemies struck. In a frenzy of violence, senators and their followers bludgeoned him and hundreds of his supporters to death, casting their bodies into the Tiber. Rome, which prided itself on law and order, had crossed a terrible line. Political dispute had turned into bloodshed, yet the dream did not die with Tiberius. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus rose to prominence. Elected tribune in 123 BCE, Gaius expanded upon his brother's ideas, proposing colonies abroad for settlement, selling grain at reduced prices, and granting new rights to allies and equestrians, the wealthy class of businessmen who long sought influence against the Senate. His reforms were more ambitious, more sweeping, and they drew both fierce support and bitter hatred. Crowds followed him through the forum, hailing him as a champion of the people. But the Senate, fearful of his popularity, resisted once more. Clashes broke out, and Gaius, pursued by enemies, took his own life in 121 BCE, while thousands of his followers were slaughtered in the streets. With the deaths of the Gracchi, reform seemed drowned in blood. Rome had shown again that violence was now part of politics, and the old ways of compromise were fading. Abroad, Rome's conquests continued. Spain, restless and difficult, was slowly subdued after long campaigns. In Asia Minor, kings paid tribute to Rome or sought its favour, knowing that resistance meant war. Generals enriched themselves, bringing home plunder and captives, their soldiers loyal more to their commanders than to the Republic. Triumphs grew ever grander. Streets filled with the roar of celebration as elephants, lions, and exotic treasures were paraded. But these triumphs carried shadows, for each returning general knew that his glory could be turned into political power. Soldiers who had followed him across mountains and rivers now looked to him, not to the Senate, for reward. In this way, the bond between army and state began to fray. The ordinary life of Romans reflected these changes in quieter ways. Markets sold spices never before tasted, fruits from distant lands, and fabrics dyed in colours unknown in Italy. Houses of the wealthy boasted tiled floors, atriums with pools, and gardens planted with foreign flowers. Banquets stretched long into the night, with musicians, dancers, and actors entertaining guests reclining on couches. Meanwhile, the poor in their insulae, or tenements, ate bread, olives, and porridge, crowded in smoky rooms, their lives dependent on handouts. The disparity was visible everywhere, and it bred resentment. Religion, too, was touched by conquest. Eastern cults spread into Rome, Isis from Egypt, Cybele from Asia Minor, offering mysteries and rituals unlike the traditional ceremonies. To many, these foreign gods seemed strange, yet others found comfort in them, seeking solace as old certainties crumbled. The Senate, wary of foreign influence, sometimes suppressed these cults, yet they persisted, reflecting the diversity of a city now at the heart of an empire. Festivals, however, still bound the people together. The Lupercalia, with young men running through the streets in goatskins, the Saturnalia, with feasting, gift-giving, and reversals of order, triumphal games honouring victorious generals. In such spectacles, the people found distraction, even joy, amid the inequalities of life. The decades after 146 BCE were thus marked by contradiction. Rome stood supreme, feared abroad, wealthy beyond measure, yet at home she was unsettled, torn between rich and poor, Senate and people, tradition and change. The Gracchi had revealed deep wounds that conquest could not heal. Slavery underpinned the economy, yet its presence displaced free citizens. Wealth gilded the city, yet it corroded the old virtues. Ambition lifted generals to greatness, yet it threatened the very balance of the republic. These were the consequences of conquest. Power unmatched, but stability uncertain. As night fell over the city, oil lamps glowed in villas and tenements alike. In the homes of the rich, courtyards echoed with music, while in cramped apartments men and women huddled over meagre meals. Senators debated in colonnades, their voices carrying into the dark, while on the streets gangs loyal to powerful patrons fought in shadows. Rome was no longer the humble city of farmers it had once been. It was a republic stretched by wealth, sharpened by ambition, and troubled by inequality. The century that lay ahead would test whether it could endure these strains or collapse beneath the weight of its own victories. Generals and civil wars, 144 BCE. By the opening years of the 1st century BCE, the Republic was already trembling under the weight of its own successes. The Mediterranean had been made into what Romans called Mare Nostrum, RC, but the politics inside the city seethed with division. Inequality widened with every conquest, and anger smouldered among citizens pushed from their farms, dependent on grain doles and the promises of ambitious men. The Senate, still dominated by ancient families, clung to its prestige, but its authority grew brittle. The people, impatient with an aristocracy deaf to their struggles, looked increasingly to strong leaders who promised change, and the army itself, once loyal to the state, began to bind its devotion to individual commanders who rewarded them with plunder and land. This shift in loyalty would prove decisive, for it was in these decades that generals rose above institutions, and the Republic began its slow collapse into civil war. The first great figure of this era was Gaius Marius, a man of humble origins from Arpinum who rose not by noble birth but by talent and persistence. Elected consul in 107 BCE, Marius reshaped Rome's military system in ways that would echo for centuries. Until his reforms, service in the legions had been restricted to property-owning citizens, men who could afford their own arms and armour. But Marius opened the legions to the landless poor, equipping them at the state's expense and binding them to him through loyalty and opportunity. The army, once a citizen militia, now became a professional force, its recruits more attached to the general who gave them wages and land than to the Senate that claimed to rule. In the short term, these reforms saved Rome, for the Republic faced dire threats. The Jugurthine War in North Africa, where Marius defeated the cunning King Jugurtha, and soon after the terrifying invasions of the Cimbri and Teutones, migrating tribes from the north. At Aquae Sextiae in 102 BCE and Vercellae in 101 BCE, Marius's soldiers annihilated their foes, saving Italy from destruction. He was hailed as the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus. Yet the seeds of future turmoil had been sown, for Marius's soldiers were bound to him by gratitude, and the precedent of armies loyal to generals rather than the Republic would prove fatal. Amid these victories, unrest boiled at home. In 91 BCE, Rome faced the social war, so named not for domestic discord, but for its allies, socii, in Italy. For centuries, allied communities had fought alongside Rome in war, bled for Rome's triumphs, and paid Roman taxes, yet they remained excluded from full citizenship. Their frustration erupted in rebellion, a war that scarred the peninsula from 91 to 88 BCE. Entire towns took up arms, forming their own senate and minting their own coins, symbols of a rival Italy. The war was bitter, marked by sieges and massacres, and Rome only prevailed after granting what the Allies demanded. Citizenship extended to nearly all free Italians. The irony was sharp. Rome fought to suppress rebellion, and in the end yielded the rights that might have prevented it. The Republic emerged larger, its citizen body now encompassing the entire peninsula, but also more unwieldy, its assemblies crowded with new voters whose voices complicated old balances of power. As if external wars were not enough, Rome soon turned upon itself. The rivalry between Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, once allies, erupted into the First Great Civil War. In 88 BCE, Sulla, a patrician with sharp ambition, was appointed to lead a campaign against the wealthy kingdom of Mithridates in Asia Minor. But Marius, jealous and unwilling to be overshadowed, maneuvered to take the command for himself. Outraged, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome itself, storming the city with armed soldiers, something no general had dared before. The precedent was shattering. Political disputes had always been bitter, sometimes violent, but never before had armies entered the sacred streets of the Republic. Blood was spilled in the Forum, enemies proscribed, property seized. Though Sulla left to fight Mithridates, the Republic had changed forever. The cycle of vengeance spun onward. Marius, though old and ill, returned to power in 87 BCE, ruling Rome with ferocity, executing opponents in waves of purges. His death the next year brought no peace, for Sulla returned victorious from the east and unleashed his own terror. As dictator, he posted lists of enemies' proscriptions publicly displayed, so any citizen could kill those named and claim rewards. Thousands died, their lands confiscated, their families ruined. Sulla restructured the Republic, empowering the Senate, curbing the tribunes, and attempting to freeze the old order in place. For a time, it seemed Rome might stabilize under his harsh reforms. Yet Sulla's retirement in 79 BCE left behind bitterness and fear. Violence had become a tool of politics, armies had entered the city, and the Republic's foundations were cracked. In the years that followed, new figures stepped onto the stage, each greater and more ambitious than the last. Pompey Magnus, called the Great, rose to prominence with military victories in Africa and Spain, hailed by his soldiers as a new Alexander. He cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in a matter of months, securing Rome's trade routes and grain supply. He marched east to defeat Mithridates, subduing the wealth of Asia Minor and bringing provinces like Syria under Roman control. His triumphs filled the city with treasure and made him adored by the people, yet mistrusted by the Senate. Alongside him stood Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose fortune was said to be so vast he could bribe whole assemblies. Crassus earned military fame too, crushing the slave revolt of Spartacus in 71 BCE, where tens of thousands of rebels were slain and 6,000 crucified along the Appian Way as a grim warning. These men, ambitious and commanding armies loyal to themselves, could not be ignored. And then there was Gaius Julius Caesar, born in 100 BCE into a patrician family of ancient lineage but modest wealth. Charismatic, eloquent and daring, Caesar advanced through the political ranks with relentless determination. He courted the masses with games and generosity, built alliances through marriage and debt, and spoke with a charm that disarmed rivals. His ambition was clear, and in time it would rival and eclipse them all. By 60 BCE, these three men, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, formed a secret alliance, later known as the First Triumvirate, an informal arrangement to dominate politics, sidestepping the Senate's resistance. Together they controlled elections, passed laws, and carved out commands. Caesar received Gaul as his province, and there he would make his name immortal. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar waged the Gallic Wars, extending Rome's reach to the Atlantic and the Rhine. He subdued tribes, defeated chieftains like Vercingetorix at Alesia, and brought untold wealth and slaves into Rome. His commentaries, written in clear, direct Latin, told of these campaigns in words that magnified his own achievements while casting them as Rome's glory. The people adored him, his soldiers worshipped him, and his rivals feared him. Pompey, meanwhile, remained in Rome, aligning himself with the Senate as jealousy of Caesar's rising fame grew. Crassus, seeking his own glory, led an ill-fated campaign against the Parthians in the east and perished in 53 BCE, his army annihilated at Carrhae. With his death, the fragile balance of the triumvirate collapsed, leaving Caesar and Pompey to circle one another as inevitable enemies. The Senate, alarmed at Caesar's power, ordered him to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. To obey would mean disgrace, trial, perhaps ruin. To resist meant civil war, In 49 BCA, Caesar made his choice. He led his legion across the Rubicon River, the northern boundary of Italy, declaring, Alia iacta est, the die is cast. With that step, the Republic plunged into open conflict. Pompey fled to the east, gathering allies, while Caesar marched swiftly through Italy, seizing the capital without resistance. The two titans clashed across Greece, and at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar's veterans triumphed, routing Pompey's larger forces. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge, but was murdered on the shore, his severed head presented to Caesar, a gift that only deepened the conqueror's sorrow. With Pompey gone, Caesar pursued campaigns across the Mediterranean, defeating remnants in Africa at Thapsus, in Spain at Munda, and entangling himself briefly in Egypt's politics, where he supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne. Each victory consolidated his power, and each triumphal procession in Rome displayed his unmatched dominance. Yet Caesar's victories raised the ultimate question: could the Republic survive such a man? In 44 BCE, the Senate named him Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. To his supporters, he promised reform, debt relief, resettlement of veterans, new colonies, expanded citizenship. To his enemies, he seemed a king in all but name, the very thing Romans had sworn never to endure again. And so, on the Ides of the 4th of March 4 BCE, as Caesar entered the Senate house, conspirators gathered around him. Knives flashed, striking 23 times. As he fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling beneath the marble, the Republic seemed momentarily avenged. Yet his death did not restore liberty. Instead, it unleashed another storm of civil wars, as allies and enemies vied for power in the vacuum Caesar left behind. The Republic, battered for decades, staggered into its final days. Between 144 BCE, Rome had been transformed. Armies became loyal to generals, politics bent to ambition, violence stalked the forum, and reform drowned in blood. The Republic had expanded to its greatest extent, stretching from Spain to Asia, yet its institutions could not contain the forces it had unleashed. The names of Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar echoed in the streets, symbols of glory and terror. Ordinary Romans lived amid triumph and fear, their city richer than ever yet more fragile than before. The age of generals had arrived, and with it the death of the Republic drew near. The age of Augustus, 27 BCE, 14 CE. The death of Julius Caesar left Rome reeling, its streets thick with fear, suspicion, and grief. The conspirators who had plunged their daggers into his body believed they were saving the Republic, restoring liberty by striking down a man who had grown too powerful. But the truth was different. Instead of breathing new life into the Republic, Caesar's assassination plunged the city into yet another cycle of violence and revenge. The Senate quaked, the people rioted, and soldiers waited to see whose banner they would follow. Into this chaos stepped men who would shape the next chapter: Marcus Antonius, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus, bound together for a time by necessity, yet destined to turn against one another. The so-called Second Triumvirate, formed in 43 BCE, was not an informal alliance like Caesar's first. It was a legal, official power granted by the people, giving these three men almost absolute control. Their rule began with proscriptions as brutal as those of Sulla, lists of enemies posted in the forum, citizens cut down in their homes, fortunes seized, blood staining the streets. Cicero, the great orator who had long defended the Republic with words, was hunted and killed, his severed head displayed as a warning. The triumvirs justified their cruelty as vengeance for Caesar's death, but the Republic, once proud of law, now knew only the blade. Together, Antony and Octavian marched east and confronted the assassins Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. There, amid the dust and clash of armies, the last hopes of the old Republic died. Brutus and Cassius, the liberators, were defeated. Both took their own lives rather than fall captive. With their deaths, the Senate no longer had champions, and Rome's destiny shifted fully into the hands of the triumvirs. Yet unity could not last. Lepidus was soon pushed aside, leaving Antony and Octavian as rivals. Antony, experienced and charismatic, aligned himself with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, Queen of the Nile, a woman of brilliance and ambition who had once enchanted Caesar himself. Their union, both political and romantic, alarmed Rome. Octavian seized on it, portraying Antony as corrupted by an Eastern queen, disloyal to Roman values. Propaganda spread like wildfire. Coins, speeches, and rumors painted Antony as a traitor, promising kingdoms to Cleopatra's children, while Octavian cast himself as the defender of Rome's traditions. The stage was set for one final reckoning. In 31 BCE, the two forces clashed at the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. Octavian's admiral Agrippa outmaneuvered Antony's fleet, and Cleopatra's ships fled in retreat, dragging Antony with them. Their cause collapsed, their armies scattered. The following year, Octavian entered Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra, cornered and defeated, chose death he by falling on his sword, she, according to legend, by the bite of an asp. With their passing, Octavian stood alone. In 27 BCE, the Senate granted him a new title, Augustus, meaning the revered one. Though careful never to call himself king, Romans still hated the word. Augustus held authority greater than any monarch. He was princeps, first citizen, but he controlled the armies, the provinces, the Senate, and the treasury. The Republic remained in name, with consuls and assemblies still convened, but the substance had shifted. The Republic had died, and in its place stood the Empire, cloaked in the forms of old institutions but guided by the hand of one man. Augustus set about stabilizing a city weary of war. He reduced the legions, settling veterans in colonies across the provinces, giving them land and rooting them in Rome's new order. He reformed taxes, reorganized provinces, and established a professional bureaucracy to manage the vast realm. In Rome itself, he boasted of transforming the city of brick into a city of marble. Temples gleamed, aqueducts carried water, and forums expanded with colonnades. He restored old religious rites, reviving ceremonies neglected during years of turmoil, and proclaimed that Rome's greatness rested upon piety as much as arms. Statues of Augustus showed him not as a conqueror dripping with spoils, but as a calm, youthful ruler, the bringer of peace. This peace, the Pax Romana, extended across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Syria, from Gaul to Egypt. Roman roads carried soldiers, merchants, and messages. Trade flourished, bringing grain from Africa, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece, spices from the East. Cities modelled on Rome rose across the provinces, their forums, amphitheatres, and baths echoing the capital's grandeur. Latin spread, law standardized, and in time Roman citizenship reached farther than ever before. Yet beneath the marble and prosperity, the shift in power was profound. Senators still debated, but they no longer held the fate of the state. Assemblies still voted, but their decisions echoed the will of Augustus. The Republic had given way to monarchy in all but name, and the people accepted it, even welcomed it. After generations of civil wars, assassinations, and proscriptions, they longed for stability more than liberty. And Augustus, cautious and clever, gave them the appearance of tradition while keeping the substance of rule in his own hands. In private, Augustus was a man of careful restraint. He dressed simply, ate modestly, and lived with discipline, presenting himself as the embodiment of old Roman virtues. Yet his household was filled with drama. His daughter Julia scandalized Rome with her affairs, and succession remained a question that haunted his reign. Still, when Augustus died in 14 CE, he left behind a Rome larger, richer, and more secure than it had ever been. His body was carried to the mausoleum he had built on the Campus Martius, and the people mourned him as a father of the state. The age of Augustus marked the dawn of empire, a new chapter where Rome's destiny stretched beyond imagination. The Republic, born centuries earlier amid huts by the Tiber, had passed away, But from its ruins rose something vaster, a realm that called itself eternal, and as lamps flickered in the city on the night of his passing, Romans could reflect on the paradox of their history, that by surrendering liberty to one man, they had gained peace for the world. Pax Romana at its height, 180 CE. When Augustus closed his eyes in 14 CE and passed the mantle of power to his stepson Tiberius, he left behind not only an empire but an expectation that Rome, once a restless republic torn by civil wars, could now enjoy generations of peace under the rule of emperors. The system he built, with its blend of monarchy and tradition, endured long after his death, guiding the empire into an age historians would later call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For more than a century and a half, from Augustus's death until the reign of Marcus Aurelius, Rome knew relative stability, prosperity, and expansion unmatched in its earlier history. It was not a peace free of battles or turmoil, but compared to the chaos of the late Republic, it was a golden season when roads stretched farther, cities thrived, and millions of people lived beneath Rome's law. Tiberius, though dour and mistrusted by many, preserved Augustus's system with care. He avoided reckless expansion and managed the empire's vast resources with frugality. His reign showed the strength of the new order. Rome no longer needed constant conquest to survive. But his suspicion and cruelty in later years, his retreat to the island of Capri, and the terror unleashed by his prefect Sejanus, reminded citizens that emperors could protect or torment at their whim. After him came Caligula, remembered for extravagance and madness, and then Claudius, who surprised all by proving a capable administrator, expanding Rome into Britain in 43 CE. Nero, the last of Augustus's dynasty, descended into infamy, accused of tyranny, excess, and even of setting Rome aflame in 64 CE, though the truth remains clouded by rumour. His suicide in 68 CE ended the Julio-Claudian line and plunged Rome briefly into civil war. Yet even such chaos could not shake the empire's foundations. The Flavian emperors, beginning with Vespasian in 69 CE, restored order. They built monuments, the greatest of which was the Colosseum, where gladiators fought, wild beasts roared, and tens of thousands of citizens gathered to be entertained. Titus, Vespasian's son, opened the amphitheatre with 100 days of games, but his reign was darkened by disasters: the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum, and a great fire in Rome itself. Domitian, his brother, ruled with severity, expanding the empire's borders yet earning hatred through paranoia before falling to assassination. Still, the system endured. It was in the 2nd century CE, under the so-called Five Good Emperors, that Rome reached its greatest height. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius guided the empire with relative stability and wisdom. Trajan, remembered as the best of rulers, carried Rome's frontiers to their farthest, conquering Dacia in 106 CE, where rich gold mines swelled the treasury, and campaigning in the east, briefly extending Rome's reach to the Persian Gulf. His monumental column still rises in Rome, its spiral relief telling the story of his victories. Hadrian, his successor, shifted focus from conquest to consolidation, travelling the empire to strengthen its defences. His walls in Britain still mark the northern edge of Rome's power, a line of stone and turf against the wild tribes beyond. He adorned Athens with splendid buildings, embraced Greek culture, and left behind monuments of enduring beauty. Antoninus Pius presided over an empire at peace, his reign marked by prosperity and justice. And Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, wrote meditations on duty and virtue even as he waged grim wars along the Danube, defending Rome's borders against Germanic tribes. During these golden decades, life across the empire flourished. Roman law spread to provinces, granting stability and rights. Cities grew in Spain, Gaul, Africa, and the East, each adorned with forums, temples, baths, and theatres modelled on the capital. Trade bound the empire together. Grain from Egypt fed the masses. Olive oil from Spain filled amphorae stacked in warehouses. Glass from Syria gleamed in Roman homes. Spices from India arrived through ports on the Red Sea. Roads stitched the realm, their stones laid with precision, carrying legions and merchants alike. At their peak, Roman roads stretched over 250,000 miles, a network so enduring that many survive today. In Rome itself, daily life reflected both splendor and strain. Senators debated in marble halls, equestrians pursued business, and the plebs thronged markets and games. The emperors gave bread and circuses, grain distributions and entertainment to keep the people satisfied. In the Colosseum, gladiators fought to the death, their struggles symbols of courage and spectacle. Chariots raced in the Circus Maximus, their drivers cheered like heroes. Baths opened daily, offering warmth, exercise and gossip. Families dined on bread, olives and wine, while the wealthy reclined at banquets rich with exotic foods. Religion, too, remained vital. Jupiter, Mars, and Venus were worshipped with rituals, while new cults, including Christianity, quietly grew in corners of the city, unnoticed for now. For all its glory, the Pax Romana was not without shadow. Slavery remained the foundation of the economy. Millions bound to labor in fields, mines, and households. Revolts flared in provinces, suppressed with brutality. In Judea, rebellion in 66 CE led to the destruction of Jerusalem's temple in 70 CE, a wound that scarred Jewish history forever. Along frontiers, restless tribes pressed against Rome's defenses, testing the strength of her legions. And even within Rome, intrigue-simmered emperors were adored or hated, their power absolute, their fates often decided by the Praetorian Guard. Yet compared to the turmoil of the late Republic, this was an age of stability unmatched in Roman history. For generations, children were born and grew to adulthood, never knowing civil war. Farmers ploughed fields, merchants filled ships, poets wrote verses, philosophers debated in porticos, and soldiers marched along distant frontiers beneath Roman standards. The empire was vast, stretching from the sands of Africa to the forests of Germany, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. More than 50 million souls lived beneath its peace, bound by law, roads, and the sense, whether in a villa in Gaul, a market in Syria, or a fishing village in Egypt, that they were part of something greater, something enduring. The Pax Romana was not eternal, but in the span between Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, Rome reached the summit of her power. The city that had once been a village of huts by the Tiber now ruled the world, and as twilight descended on a typical evening in the capital, lamps flickered in marble homes and smoky taverns alike, casting their glow upon senators, merchants, slaves and freedmen. The empire seemed unshakable, its roads stretching forever, its aqueducts carrying life, its monuments proclaiming eternity. Few could imagine that this golden age, so steady and assured, would ever come to an end. Spectacle and society, 1st-2nd centuries CE. Beneath the calm facade of the Pax Romana, life in Rome and across the empire pulsed with spectacle, ritual, and the rhythms of society. The people of Rome had always hungered for entertainment, and the emperors, mindful that bread alone could not satisfy, fed this hunger with grandeur. To walk into the city in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE was to step into a world where stone and marble whispered both power and pleasure, where daily existence was stitched together by ritual, law, commerce, and amusement. It was a society at its peak, glittering with achievement, yet full of contrasts between splendor and hardship, tradition and indulgence. The most dazzling emblem of Rome's devotion to spectacle was the Flavian amphitheatre, later known simply as the Colosseum. Rising from the heart of the city, its massive stone arches seemed to scrape the sky, accommodating 50,000 spectators at once. Built under Vespasian and inaugurated by Titus with 100 days of games, it stood as both a gift and a warning, a gift of joy to the people, and a reminder that emperors could command lives at will. Inside, the roar of crowds thundered beneath awnings stretched to shade them from the sun, while gladiators battled on sands stained with blood. Men in armor, trained for death, fought wild beasts imported from Africa: lions, leopards, elephants, even crocodiles. Spectacle was not confined to violence alone. Elaborate hunts and reenactments of naval battles filled the arena. Ships floating in water poured into the arena's floor. The people, intoxicated by such scenes, cheered emperors who staged them, seeing in their generosity the gods' favour. But the Colosseum was not the only stage of life. The Circus Maximus, older still, could hold more than 200,000 people, its track echoing with the pounding of chariots. Teams, reds, blues, greens and whites, drew fanatical support. Men and women bet fortunes, shouted themselves hoarse, and rioted when outcomes displeased them. Drivers, often slaves or freedmen, could rise to celebrity, their names known across the empire, their victories celebrated in graffiti and songs. Chariot racing was not merely a pastime, it was a passion that bound the masses to the heart of the city. Beyond games, society revolved around the daily rituals of Roman life. The baths, vast complexes of stone and marble, were centres not only for cleansing but for conversation, business and relaxation. Citizens of every class gathered there, slipping into pools of hot and cold water, sweating in steamy chambers, exercising in open courtyards. In the great baths of Caracalla or Trajan, mosaics gleamed underfoot, statues of gods and heroes lined the halls, and the air hummed with talk of politics, poetry and trade. To bathe was not simply to wash, it was to participate in the rhythm of Roman sociability, where distinctions of wealth could blur, if only for an hour, in shared waters. In the Forum, the heart of public life, senators strode beneath colonnades, orators addressed crowds, and merchants displayed wares. Bronze tablets recorded laws and decrees, while temples to Jupiter, Saturn and Castor and Pollux reminded all that the gods' favour sustained Rome's order. Stalls sold bread, olives, fish and spices. Craftsmen hammered bronze and silver into tools and ornaments. The Forum was both sacred and profane, political and commercial, a place where citizens could feel the pulse of their city. Family life formed the bedrock of society, governed by the principle of patria potestas, the authority of the father. The paterfamilias ruled his household with near absolute power, controlling property, marriages, and even the lives of his children. Yet within these walls, warmth and intimacy existed too. Women, though excluded from political office, managed households, oversaw slaves, and in wealthier homes directed education and estates. Children learned letters, numbers, and the stories of Rome's heroes. Education, especially among the elite, included the study of Greek philosophy and literature, embedding Rome ever deeper into the cultural fabric it had inherited from Greece. Religion suffused daily life. Traditional rituals honoured Jupiter, Juno and Minerva, while household altars to the Lares and Penates anchored faith at home. Festivals like Saturnalia, marked by feasting and gift-giving, turned hierarchies upside down for a brief season of merriment. Foreign cults, too, spread widely. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, and soon Christianity, still a small and persecuted sect, whispered of salvation and eternal life. These new faiths challenged old traditions, but the empire absorbed them, just as it had absorbed countless peoples and customs. The empire's wealth was evident in villas sprawling across the countryside, decorated with frescoes of gardens, myths and landscapes. Mosaic floors depicted hunting scenes, banquets and gods. In cities, aqueducts carried fresh water for fountains, homes and baths, their arches striding for miles across valleys. Roads, paved with stone, bore legions and merchants, binding distant provinces to Rome. The provinces themselves thrived in this age. Gaul with its vineyards, Spain with its olive groves, Africa with its grain fields, the East with its trade in silks and spices. Provincial towns grew into miniature Romes, their forums and theatres echoing the capital. Yet for all the splendour, inequality loomed. The aristocracy dined on peacock and flamingo tongues, reclined on couches of ivory, and drank wine aged in amphorae, while the poor survived on bread, porridge, and olives. Slavery remained ever present, millions bound in service, their labour fueling estates, workshops, and households. Revolts, like that of Spartacus decades earlier, haunted memory, but most endured in silence, their voices rarely heard. The empire's peace rested on their backs, and their toil built its monuments. The Pax Romana's society was one of contradictions, leisure and labour, grandeur and suffering, liberty for a few and servitude for many. But it was also an age when the empire seemed most itself confident, prosperous, diverse, and enduring. From the roar of the Colosseum to the quiet flicker of a household altar, from the marble baths to the dusty roads of distant provinces, Rome's people lived within a structure vast and unyielding, yet alive with energy. As dusk fell over the city, shadows stretched long across the Colosseum, where the day's games had ended. Vendors packed their stalls in the forum, children chased one another in alleys, and lamps were lit in insulae and villas alike. Music drifted from banquet halls, while prayers whispered before household gods. It was a society bound together not only by law and empire, but by ritual and spectacle, by the rhythm of daily life as much as by the grandeur of its monument. In those long centuries of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Rome appeared eternal, its society a glittering reflection of its empire at peace. Crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE. The Pax Romana, that golden stretch of peace and prosperity, could not last forever. By the middle of the 3rd century CE, Rome's vast empire began to tremble beneath pressures both from within and without. The century between 235 and 284 became remembered as the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, borders quivered under invasions, and the delicate balance of Roman society frayed. To live through these decades was to exist in a world where stability had once seemed eternal, and where chaos now seeped into every corner of daily life. The first blow came with the death of Emperor Severus Alexander in 235 CE, murdered by his own soldiers along the Rhine. His fall marked the end of the Severan dynasty, and with it the illusion of firm succession. What followed was a parade of emperors, many of them soldiers proclaimed by their legions. Rarely did they rule more than a year or two before falling to assassination or defeat. Historians would later count more than 20 emperors in just 50 years, though the exact tally remains debated. The imperial throne became less a position of authority than a dangerous prize, glittering and deadly, its occupants fragile as glass. At the empire's borders, enemies pressed hard. To the east, the Sassanid Persians surged against Roman lands, defeating armies and capturing territory. In 260 CE, the Persian king Shapur I captured Emperor Valerian himself, parading him in chains before Persian crowds, a humiliation Rome had never endured before. Legends whispered that Valerian was later flayed and stuffed as a trophy, though the truth may have been less grotesque. Still, the symbolism was clear. Rome's aura of invincibility had cracked. To the north, Germanic tribes pushed across the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into Roman lands, even reaching as far as Italy and Spain. Villages burned, fields were abandoned, and refugees streamed into cities already strained. Within the empire, instability festered. The currency, once anchored in silver, was debased as emperors struck more coins with less precious metal, hoping to pay soldiers and fund wars. Inflation soared. What once bought a loaf of bread now bought only a crumb. Farmers, unable to sell grain at fair prices, abandoned their fields. Famine haunted the land, and plagues swept through, thinning the population already battered by war. In some regions, the population shrank by half. Cities, too, suffered. Once vibrant trade slowed, as bandits and invasions cut roads and sea lanes. The once mighty economy of Rome became patchwork, provinces cut off from one another, forced to rely on what they could produce locally. In the west, Gaul and Britain declared independence under the so-called Gallic Empire, while in the east, Palmyra under Queen Zenobia carved out its own realm, stretching from Syria to Egypt. For a time, the Roman world fractured, no longer one empire but several competing states, each claiming legitimacy. Amid the chaos, ordinary people clung to rituals of daily life. Families still lit lamps before their household gods, still bathed in the waters of local baths if they could. Farmers tilled fields under threat of raids. Merchants bargained in markets diminished by fear. Yet the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. Soldiers, once protectors, could as easily become marauders, demanding supplies or seizing homes. Taxes rose ever higher, squeezing peasants until rebellion flickered in the provinces. Religion shifted as well. In times of chaos, old gods seemed less certain, their temples still standing but their power doubted. New faiths gained strength. The cult of Mithras flourished among soldiers, offering brotherhood and salvation. Christianity, though still illegal, grew quietly, its promise of eternal life drawing the poor, the dispossessed, and even some of the elite. Persecutions flared, as emperors sought to blame Christians for misfortunes, but the faith endured, growing roots too deep to be torn out. Despite the turmoil, some emperors did achieve moments of stability. Aurelian, ruling from 270 to 275, was one such figure. Known as restorer of the world, he defeated both the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway empires, reuniting Rome's fractured lands. He built a massive wall around the city of Rome itself, Aurelian's wall acknowledging that even the capital might not be safe. His reign, though brief, glimmered with competence, a reminder of what strong leadership could accomplish. Yet he too fell to assassination, the cycle repeating. For the people of Rome, these decades felt like an unending storm. Grain ships from Africa no longer arrived reliably. Riots broke out in the city when food was scarce. Theatres and circuses grew quieter, games fewer, as emperors had neither funds nor focus to stage grand spectacles. Instead, the empire's energy turned inward, desperately trying to hold itself together. By the late 3rd century, exhaustion hung over the empire. Soldiers had fought endless campaigns, citizens endured endless taxes, provinces had seen endless devastation. But from this darkness would emerge reform. A soldier named Diocletian rose to power in 284, bringing order where chaos had ruled. His reign would mark the end of the crisis and the beginning of a new, transformed Rome. Still, the memory of the crisis of the 3rd century lingered long after. It had shown that Rome, mighty as it seemed, could break. The Pax Romana, once so serene, now felt like a dream from a distant age. The people had learned to live with uncertainty, their faith in eternity shaken, their empire scarred but not destroyed. Division and reforms of Diocletian, 284-305 CE. The crisis of the 3rd century had left Rome's empire battered and gasping. Armies had turned into kingmakers. Emperors had risen and fallen like shadows across a wall. Provinces had broken away and returned, and the very heart of Roman life had trembled with doubt. When Diocletian rose to the purple in 284 CE, he inherited not the Rome of Augustus or Hadrian, but a realm deeply scarred, fragile, and uncertain of its own survival. To imagine that one man could restore stability seemed almost impossible, yet through sheer determination, ruthless organization, and a willingness to reshape what Rome meant, Diocletian set about remaking the empire. His reign would become remembered as one of the most transformative in Rome's long story, not because it revived the old world, but because it constructed something new upon its ruins. Diocletian was not born in marble halls or among patrician lineages. He came from the rougher soil of Illyricum, the rugged Balkans, where hard winters and harder lives forged men of endurance. Rising through the military ranks, he was acclaimed by his soldiers in 284 after the assassination of Emperor Numerian. What set him apart was not simply his skill in battle, though he had that, but his recognition that Rome could no longer be ruled as it had been in the days of Augustus. The empire was too vast, the pressures too constant for one man to bear alone. His vision would reconfigure Roman power in ways that rippled for centuries. His first great reform was the Tetrarchy, announced around 293 CE. No longer would a single emperor rule. Instead, 4 would share the burden. 2 senior emperors titled Augusti, and 2 junior emperors titled Caesares. Diocletian himself took the eastern half of the empire, with its wealthier provinces and vulnerable frontiers, while his co-Augustus, Maximian, governed the west. Under them, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus served as Caesar's heirs and assistants, who managed distant regions and campaigns. This system spread power more evenly, reduced the danger of usurpation, and ensured that no frontier was left without imperial oversight. For a brief time, the Tetrarchy gave Rome something it had desperately lacked: order. The reforms did not stop with politics. Diocletian reshaped the very bones of the empire's administration. Provinces were divided into smaller units, grouped into larger dioceses, each overseen by officials loyal to the emperor rather than local elites. Taxes were regularized, assessed not in erratic tribute but through a more systematic census of land and production. Soldiers were stationed more strategically, garrisons strengthened at vulnerable points, and fortifications rebuilt. In his hands, Rome began to feel less like the loose republic of memory and more like a carefully managed state machine. Yet his reforms came with burdens. Taxation grew heavier, pressing down on farmers who already struggled after decades of invasion and plague. The coinage was restructured, but inflation still haunted markets. In 301, Diocletian issued his famous edict on maximum prices, an attempt to control inflation by fixing the cost of goods and wages. The document listed hundreds of items, from a loaf of bread to a slave's daily pay, setting ceilings beyond which sellers could not charge. But the edict proved impossible to enforce across such a sprawling empire. Markets rebelled, goods vanished, and trade shifted into the shadows of black markets. In the effort to impose order, Diocletian had revealed how fractured the economy had become. Religion, too, lay within his reach. Though earlier emperors had persecuted Christians sporadically, Diocletian sought uniformity of belief as a means of shoring up imperial unity. The old gods, Jupiter above all, remained the official pillars of Rome, their temples, the symbols of tradition. But Christians, growing in number and confidence, rejected sacrifice to those gods. In 303, Diocletian launched what became known as the Great Persecution, ordering churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and Christians stripped of rights. Many were imprisoned, some executed. For believers, it was a time of terror. And yet, instead of crushing the faith, the persecution strengthened its resolve. Communities of Christians endured, hidden yet unbroken, planting seeds that would one day outlast the empire itself. Life for ordinary Romans under Diocletian was a mixture of fear and adaptation. In cities, people adjusted to stricter rule, where imperial edicts touched more corners of daily life than before. Farmers, bound to their land by tightening laws, found mobility increasingly restricted as Rome sought to ensure its food supply. Soldiers, though better provisioned and more disciplined, endured constant campaigns against Persians in the east and Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube. Merchants still traded in bustling markets, but always with the eye of officials hovering near. Even festivals, still celebrated with colour and music, were shadowed by the sense that Rome was becoming something different, less the old republic of free men, more the regimented structure of an empire turning inward. The Tetrarchy, for all its brilliance, contained fragility. It depended on balance, on cooperation among men whose ambitions might one day outgrow their roles. But for 2 decades, it held. Diocletian's genius lay not only in designing the system, but in recognizing his own limits. In 305 CE, he did something almost unthinkable for a Roman emperor. He abdicated. Ill and weary, he retired to his palace in Split, on the Dalmatian coast, a vast and luxurious villa overlooking the sea. There he tended gardens and withdrew from the storms of politics, remarking that if his fellow rulers could see the cabbages he grew, they would never urge him back to power. The empire, for a time, carried on with the structure he left behind. The tetrarchy continued, though cracks soon began to show as new emperors rose and rivalries sharpened. But Diocletian's mark remained. He had not restored the Rome of old. That Rome was gone. Instead, he had forged something new, a more bureaucratic, militarized empire, capable of survival, but at the cost of freedom and tradition. The Republic had long since faded. Now even the softer echoes of early empire seemed distant. What remained was a state machine, enduring, rigid, and prepared for the storms to come. To the people of his age, Diocletian seemed a paradox. He brought order after chaos, yet at the cost of heavier burdens. He strengthened the empire, yet divided it. He persecuted, yet his actions helped fuel the spread of Christianity that would soon reshape Rome forever. His reign was not a return to greatness but a pivot, a moment when Rome ceased trying to revive its golden past and instead redefined itself for survival. When the sun set over his coastal palace, the sea glowing red in the evening light, Diocletian could look back, knowing that he had done what few had managed in that age. He had held the empire together. For those who lived beneath his rule, life may have been harder, more controlled, and less free, but it was life within a Rome that had not fallen, that still carried the weight of centuries upon its shoulders. And in that fragile survival lay the possibility of what was to follow the triumphs and trials of Constantine, and the next great turn in the long story of Rome. Constantine and the Christian Empire, 306–337 CE, when the old structure of the tetrarchy began to collapse under the weight of rival ambitions. One figure rose from the struggle whose reign would change Rome more profoundly than any emperor since Augustus. His name was Constantine, and though he was born into the turmoil of soldiers' camps and imperial intrigues, he would emerge as the ruler who welded together the military strength of Rome with a new spiritual foundation. In his time, the empire was not restored to its republican origins, nor even to its early imperial glory, but instead was reshaped in a manner that echoed through all the centuries that followed. From 306 to 337 CE, Constantine presided over a transformation that was political, cultural, and above all, religious. Constantine was the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the Caesars under Diocletian's tetrarchic system, and of Helena, a woman whose later sainthood would only enhance his legend. Born around 272 CE in Nisus, in the Balkans, Constantine grew up in the world of soldiers, learning the art of command and the weight of loyalty. When Constantius died in 306 at Eboracum, modern York in Britain, his troops immediately acclaimed Constantine as emperor. This act, though contrary to the careful order of succession Diocletian had tried to design, revealed a truth about Rome that no reform could erase. The loyalty of the army remained decisive. Constantine's reign began not in smooth legality, but in the clash of rival claims. For years the empire was torn by civil wars. Rivals like Maxentius in Italy and Licinius in the east contended for supremacy. Constantine's path was marked by constant campaigning, moving his legions across Europe in pursuit of order through victory. Yet what made him unforgettable was not simply his generalship, but the vision he claimed before one of the most crucial battles in Roman history. In 312 CE, as Constantine marched toward Rome to face Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he reportedly experienced a vision in the sky, a cross of light above the sun, and the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign you will conquer. That night, he dreamed that Christ instructed him to place the Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, upon his soldiers' shields. The next day, under that emblem, Constantine's forces defeated Maxentius, whose army was swept into the Tiber as the bridge collapsed in chaos. Maxentius himself drowned, and Constantine entered Rome as master of the West. The victory was decisive not only politically but spiritually. In 313, Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, a proclamation that granted freedom of worship throughout the empire and brought Christianity out of the shadows of persecution. For centuries, Christians had been hunted, imprisoned, and executed for their refusal to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Now, under Constantine, their faith was not only tolerated but welcomed into public life. Churches rose in cities, bishops gained influence, and the faith that had once been whispered in catacombs began to resonate in basilicas. Yet Constantine was not simply a Christian convert in the modern sense. His embrace of the new faith was gradual, mingling with older traditions. Coins still bore the image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and Constantine spoke often of a single supreme god rather than always naming Christ. But the shift was unmistakable. The emperor favoured Christians, exempted clergy from some taxes, funded the construction of great churches such as the Lateran Basilica in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and gave bishops a role in imperial councils. In 324, Constantine defeated Licinius and emerged as sole ruler of the empire. His authority now stretched from Britain to Egypt, and with it came the freedom to shape Rome according to his vision. That vision was not bound to the old capital on the Tiber, weighed down by centuries of senatorial privilege and decaying infrastructure. Instead, he turned east, to the ancient city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosporus, between Europe and Asia, near the wealth of the eastern provinces. There, in 330 CE, he dedicated a new capital, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Built with forums, palaces, and a senate of its own, it became the new Rome, destined to outlast the old by 1,000 years. The founding of Constantinople was more than geography. It symbolized the empire's pivot eastward, toward the lands of wealth, trade, and enduring strength. Rome itself, though still honored with monuments, became less central, while the power of the Christian church in the new capital grew alongside the emperor's presence. Constantine's reign was not only about cities and churches, but also about doctrine. As Christianity expanded, disagreements fractured the faithful. Was Christ equal to the Father or subordinate? Was he divine, human, or a mysterious blend of both? These were not questions Constantine could ignore, for a divided church threatened a divided empire. In 325 CE, he summoned bishops from across the Christian world to Nicaea, in Asia Minor, to hold a council that would seek unity. The Council of Nicaea produced a creed affirming that Christ was of the same substance as the Father, a declaration that became central to Christian orthodoxy. Constantine presided not as a theologian but as an emperor seeking harmony, his presence at the council a symbol of how deeply the fates of Rome and the Church had become entwined. In daily life, Constantine's changes were felt in many ways. Christians emerged from secrecy, celebrating openly, building community centers and schools. Pagan rituals continued, and temples still stood, but the balance of power had shifted. Bishops began to wield influence not only over spiritual matters but also civic ones, mediating disputes and managing charity. Soldiers fought under standards that carried the chiro, the emblem of the cross woven into banners that once bore only eagles. In marketplaces, coins circulated bearing the emperor's face and hints of his dual devotion to both the old sun god and the new Christian god. The very rhythm of time shifted, as Sunday gained recognition as a day of rest, reflecting Christian practice woven into imperial law. Constantine himself lived in a world where ceremony and majesty cloaked imperial power. His court grew more elaborate, his attire more regal, his presence more distant. Where Augustus had once been princeps, the first citizen, Constantine became dominus, lord and master, reflecting the changing nature of Rome from a civic community to a hierarchical empire. Subjects prostrated themselves before him, as if before a sacred figure, blurring the line between earthly emperor and divine authority. And yet, for all his power, Constantine remained a man aware of his mortality. Near the end of his life, weakened by illness, he sought baptism, delaying the rite until his final days, in the belief that the sacrament would wash away a lifetime of sins. In 337 CE, he died near Nicomedia, baptized as a Christian, leaving behind an empire forever altered. The Rome he passed on was not the Rome of Augustus, nor even of Diocletian. It was something transformed, bearing the imprint of Christianity, turned eastward toward Constantinople, and governed by a vision of imperial power that fused religion and rule into one. His reign did not prevent the trials that lay ahead, the invasions, the fractures, the eventual fall of the Western Empire, but it ensured that when Rome fell, something else endured. The Christian Church, nourished under Constantine's hand, became the heir of empire, carrying its memory, language, and faith into a world beyond Roman walls. To later generations, Constantine became both a hero and a puzzle. To Christians, he was the first emperor who knelt before the cross, the patron who had ended centuries of persecution. To others, he was a politician who used faith as a tool, whose vision was as much about unity as about belief. Yet no one could deny his legacy. He had not only ruled an empire, he had redirected its destiny. As the sun set over Constantinople's rising domes, the legacy of Constantine shimmered on the waters of the Bosporus. Rome had begun as a city of farmers and warriors on the banks of the Tiber. Under Constantine, it had become a realm of churches, bishops, and emperors who bore the mark of Christ upon their banners. The empire still stood, but it was no longer the same. It was something enduring, something that even the fall of Rome itself could not erase. Decline of the Western Empire, 4th-5th centuries CE. The centuries that followed Constantine's reign were heavy with the weight of change, and though the Roman Empire endured in name, the cracks in its foundation deepened. What unfolded in the 4th and 5th centuries was not a sudden collapse, but a long, slow unraveling of a world that had once seemed eternal. To those who lived through these years, it felt less like a single catastrophe than a relentless tightening of burdens, invasions, taxes, betrayals, and fears that pressed upon farmers, soldiers, senators, and slaves alike. The Western Empire, with Rome at its heart, staggered under pressures that no emperor, no reform, no army could ultimately withstand. In the late 4th century, after Constantine's death, the empire was divided among his sons and heirs, a division that revealed the difficulties of holding together so vast a territory. While the eastern half, centered on Constantinople, thrived with wealth from Egypt and Asia Minor, the western half grew poorer, more vulnerable, and increasingly dependent on the strength of mercenaries. The distinction between the two halves widened steadily, and by 395 CE, after the death of Theodosius I, the last ruler to govern the whole empire, the separation became permanent. His sons inherited east and west, and from that moment on, the Western Empire's decline accelerated. The challenges were many, but none were more disruptive than the migrations and invasions of peoples from beyond Rome's frontiers. For centuries, the empire's borders had been guarded by legions along the Rhine and the Danube. Yet these boundaries were never impenetrable, and in the 4th century, waves of movement reshaped the map of Europe. The Huns, fierce horsemen from the Eurasian steppes, began pressing westward, driving other tribes before them. The Goths, seeking refuge, crossed into Roman territory in 376. What began as asylum soon became disaster. Poorly treated by corrupt Roman officials, the Goths rebelled, and in 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, they inflicted a crushing defeat upon the Roman army, killing Emperor Valens himself. The loss shocked the empire, for it showed that Rome's legions were no longer invincible. In the wake of Adrianople, the Goths roamed within the empire, alternately enemies and allies, sometimes settled as federates on Roman soil, sometimes plundering cities when promises were broken. The pattern became familiar. Rome, unable to repel them outright, bargained, granted lands, or paid tribute. Other tribes followed similar paths. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans pushed into Gaul and Spain. The Franks began to establish themselves more firmly along the Rhine. Each group carved its place within lands that had once been firmly Roman, eroding the empire's authority. Amid this, the city of Rome itself suffered humiliations that earlier generations would have thought impossible. In 410 CE, the Gothic king Alaric led his forces into the Eternal City. For 3 days, Rome was plundered. Though churches and some lives were spared, the psychological blow was immense. Rome, which for 8 centuries had stood unbreached by foreign armies, was now humbled. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, captured the despair. My voice sticks in my throat, and as I dictate, sobs choke me. The city which took the whole world has itself been taken. A will. The sack of Rome was not the empire's end, but it revealed how far the West had fallen. The emperors of the 5th century often resided not in Rome but in Ravenna, a more defensible city protected by marshes and close to the Adriatic. The Senate, once a proud institution, had little real power. Real authority shifted into the hands of generals, many of them of barbarian origin, who commanded mercenary troops. Figures like Stilicho, Aetius and Ricimer held sway, making and unmaking emperors at will. The imperial throne became a puppet seat, its occupant subject to the will of the strongest military man of the moment. Economically, the Western Empire faltered. Trade networks shrank as insecurity grew, roads deteriorated, aqueducts fell into disrepair, and cities shrank in population. Farmers were crushed by taxation, their harvests demanded by officials desperate to feed armies and urban centres. Many abandoned their lands, seeking protection under powerful landlords, a shift that laid the groundwork for the feudal systems that would later dominate medieval Europe. Meanwhile, coinage continued to lose value, barter became more common, and the material wealth of the empire dwindled. Religion, however, surged as a force of cohesion and consolation. After Theodosius I had declared Christianity the official religion of the empire in 380 CE, pagan temples were gradually closed, their rituals banned. Bishops emerged as powerful figures, guiding communities not only spiritually but politically. In cities where imperial officials were absent or weak, the church provided leadership, charity, and a sense of continuity. The writings of Augustine of Hippo, particularly the City of God, offered believers hope that while Rome the city might fall, the heavenly city of God was eternal. Still, invasions pressed on. In 455 CE, the Vandals, having established a kingdom in North Africa, sailed across the Mediterranean and sacked Rome again. Unlike Alaric's sack, which was restrained, the Vandals plundered for 2 weeks, carrying off treasures, including sacred vessels from the Temple of Jerusalem once displayed in Roman triumph. The word vandalism would forever echo their reputation. Rome staggered under the humiliation, its wealth stripped, its prestige dimmed further. Perhaps the most infamous moment came in 476 CE. The Western throne had already been diminished, but when the soldier Odoacer, a Germanic leader, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, it symbolized the end of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer did not claim the imperial title, but instead declared himself King of Italy, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Eastern Emperor, Zeno, accepted the gesture, acknowledging Odoacer as ruler of Italy. To contemporaries, it may have seemed a formality. To later generations, it marked the fall of Rome. For ordinary people, however, the transition was less dramatic than the histories suggest. Many had already been living under local kings or generals rather than a distant emperor. Taxes were collected by new rulers, but the fields were ploughed, markets opened, and prayers continued much as before. What changed most was the recognition that the Western Empire no longer commanded armies, no longer minted coins that inspired confidence, no longer carried the authority it once had. In the East, the empire lived on, stronger and wealthier, its capital at Constantinople gleaming with domes and mosaics. To those in the Eastern Empire, the fall of the West was tragic but not fatal to Rome itself, for they considered themselves true Romans still. To those in the West, however, a chapter had closed. The Eternal City had lost its empire, and though it would remain a spiritual centre for Christianity, it would never again be the capital of a political world-spanning power. The decline of the Western Empire was not a single event, but a long symphony of decay punctuated by shocks that reverberated through centuries. From Adrianople to the sacks of Rome, from the migrations of tribes to the rise of local warlords, it was a slow fading of a world order. Yet from its ashes, new societies were forming kingdoms that blended Roman law with Germanic customs, Christian faith with pagan heritage. The Middle Ages were being born. In quiet villages of Gaul, in the hills of Spain, in the plains of Italy, life continued, but under new banners. The aqueducts that once carried water fell silent, but churches' bells rang out across fields. The legions no longer marched, but warbands rode beneath chieftains. Rome the empire had ended, but Rome the idea lived on in language, in law, in the church, and in the memory of a world that had once ruled from the Tiber to the Euphrates. Legacy of Rome, 476 CE and beyond. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE might have marked the end of emperors in the city of Rome, but it did not mark the end of Rome itself. In truth, Rome was far too deeply woven into the fabric of the world to disappear with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. Its language, its laws, its roads, its architecture, its faith, all of these lingered, reshaping themselves in new forms, carried forward by peoples who had once looked to Rome in awe or in defiance. What the world lost in empire, it gained in legacy, for the Roman spirit endured, stretching across centuries, whispering into the hearts of kings, scholars, priests, and ordinary folk who never forgot what had been. Latin remained the most enduring gift of Rome. Though the empire's legions no longer marched, its tongue lived on in villages, monasteries, and courts. From Spain to Gaul to Italy, the everyday speech of common people shifted slowly, evolving into new forms that would one day become Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. For centuries, Latin remained the language of learning, the church, and law. A priest in a small village of the 8th century, chanting in Latin, connected himself directly to the ancient prayers once spoken in Rome. Scholars copying manuscripts in scriptoria preserved not only the Bible but also Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, and Livy, ensuring that Roman thought would never be lost entirely. The words of Rome flowed like a river, branching into streams but always carrying with them the memory of their source. Law too outlasted the empire's fall. Roman legal principles, contracts, citizenship, rights and responsibilities remained the backbone of governance in lands that had once been provinces. Even when kings replaced emperors, they often styled themselves in Roman terms, issuing decrees in the name of Roman authority. Centuries later, in the 6th century, Emperor Justinian of the Eastern Empire would codify Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental work that became the foundation for legal systems across Europe. From medieval courts to modern constitutions, the logic and fairness of Roman law echoed, shaping ideas of justice and governance. Architecture, too, bore witness to the Roman touch. Though many aqueducts crumbled and amphitheatres fell silent, their ruins inspired awe. In Gaul, peasants lived among the remnants of Roman baths and walls. In Britain, Roman roads guided travellers long after the legions had departed. Churches rose upon old basilicas, reusing Roman columns and stones, carrying forward both the materials and the style of the empire. Even the new rulers who had once been enemies of Rome admired its engineering. The Goths, Vandals, and Franks often made use of Roman cities, living among their stones, recognizing that the legacy of Rome was as practical as it was monumental. Perhaps the greatest heir to Rome was not in the West at all, but in the East. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, thrived for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West. To the Byzantines, they were Romans still, their emperors heirs of Augustus, their armies defenders of Roman order. Their capital glittered with treasures, the Hagia Sophia rising with a dome unlike anything the old Romans had ever seen, mosaics shimmering with gold, and a court that blended Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian faith into something new. They fought Persians, Arabs, and Turks, carried the torch of Rome into the Middle Ages, and preserved the empire's memory until Constantinople itself fell in 1453 CE. Religion, too, bore Rome's stamp. Christianity, once persecuted under Roman law, had grown into the empire's official faith and, after the fall of the West, became the strongest unifying force in Europe. The Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, became the shepherd of the Western Church, his authority rooted in the city that had once commanded armies. Monasteries rose across Europe, where monks preserved learning, copied texts, and prayed in rhythms that stretched back to Roman discipline. Pilgrims walked roads first built by legions, now lined with shrines and chapels, transforming imperial pathways into spiritual journeys. Rome's empire had fallen, but Rome's church rose higher than ever, guiding the souls of millions. The idea of Rome, its grandeur, its power, its eternity never faded. Medieval kings longed to cloak themselves in its prestige. In 800 CE, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope, reviving the title as the Holy Roman Empire, a kingdom that, despite its fractured nature, sought legitimacy through Rome's name. Centuries later, the Renaissance would look back to Rome with longing, studying its ruins, reviving its art, and imitating its philosophy. Humanists pored over Latin texts, rediscovering Cicero's eloquence and Caesar's histories. Architects designed domes and arches inspired by ancient models. Painters imagined scenes of Rome with reverence, turning ruins into symbols of lost glory and eternal inspiration. Beyond Europe, Rome's legacy spread even further. The republics of the modern world, from the United States to many European nations, drew upon Roman ideals of citizenship and governance. Senators still sit in chambers, their title drawn directly from Roman tradition. Capitals rise with domes inspired by Roman temples. Legal phrases in Latin adorn government buildings and universities, reminding all who see them that Rome's shadow stretches even into the present. For the ordinary people who lived in the centuries after Rome's fall, the memory of the empire was less about marble halls and more about continuity of life. Farmers still ploughed fields once surveyed by Roman engineers. Markets still bustled in towns that bore Roman names. Festivals blended old pagan traditions with Christian feasts, preserving fragments of Roman culture in daily life. Even in the darkest of the Middle Ages, when warlords clashed and kingdoms crumbled, people spoke of Rome as the standard of greatness, the world that had once been. The fall of the Western Empire had been a slow, painful unraveling, but its legacy was an enduring thread, weaving itself into every corner of history. Rome had been a city of hills, an empire of provinces, a world of roads and laws and gods and armies. But it became more than that. It became an idea. Ideas cannot be sacked, cannot be burned, cannot be killed. They pass from one generation to the next, reshaped, remembered, revered. Rome, the empire ended in 476 CE. Rome, the idea endures still. And so, as the echoes of Rome fade into the distance, the story of the empire settles into quiet memory. The rise, the triumphs, the conflicts, and the fall all are softened now, like old carvings worn smooth by centuries of touch. What was once the roar of legions and the thunder of empire is now the gentle hum of influence, flowing quietly through time. The laws that still shape justice, the words that still shape thought, the arches and domes that still inspire builders all whisper of Rome, but no longer shout. In the hush of night, Rome becomes less a place of conquest and more a dream of continuity. Its roads, once filled with merchants and soldiers, are now only lines upon old maps, travelled in the imagination. Its emperors, once clad in purple and surrounded by splendour, now stand still as statues, patient and silent, reminders of what was. The empire becomes a story told by firelight, a memory passed from one voice to another, carried onward into new centuries. And as the listener drifts, Rome itself seems to dissolve into the rhythm of sleep. The stone columns, the mosaics, the crowded forums all blur into a quiet landscape of shadows and starlight. The empire that once stretched from Britain to the deserts of Arabia is now no more than a steady breath, a gentle heartbeat of history echoing in the dark. The rise and fall of Rome is complete, yet its presence endures in every word spoken tonight. May the weight of empire slip away now, leaving only calm reflection, gentle quiet, and the certainty that even the greatest stories can bring rest.